Let's just run the scenario that someone had adult children and then they got into a new relationship and had a new child, like with a new partner. By the time that person then passes away and their children receive the proceeds, the adult children are going to be adults and probably don't benefit from the inheritance, whereas the younger child from the new relationship would, just because of the timing.
Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics such as investing, cash flow, budgeting, saving, passive income, debt management, and much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I'm Billy and I'm joined by my co-host,
Andrew. Bill's back again, back at our favourite time of the week in front of the microphone and talking to me for half an hour.
That's it, Andrew, and sponsored by Tommy Hilfiger by the looks of it. So we're wearing the same top, actually. It's just a different colour.
We haven't, I didn't notice that. And the white shirt as well.
There you go.
We haven't asked for sponsors for a little while, but maybe that's what we're doing.
Maybe let's say to.
We're asking Tommy for a sponsorship.
That's it.
Podcast.
What do you reckon the probability of getting that across the line is?
Oh, mate, with two strapping lads like us.
It's got to be quite high, right?
100%. Either that or a modelling gig. We'll take either.
That's it. Andrew, what are we talking to everybody about today?
Yeah, so today we're talking a little bit about blended families.
Yep.
So talking about some of the financial planning considerations for blended families, some of the things that you could consider. And I think it's just becoming more and more topical, just with, number of people that are entering into relationships, and there's, kids from a prior relationship and second marriages and all of that stuff. And it's a pretty complex minefield when you start talking about this and some of the financial implications. So we're going to unpack it a little bit and give our viewers and our listeners some things to consider.
Yeah, this goes so far and wide, and almost every circumstance that you come across is different.
Yeah, all unique.
It's all unique, and the ramifications if you get this wrong is pretty significant as well too. And I just think of a really simplistic example where maybe you get into a relationship when you're older, and your kids are already grown up and what have you, and what have you. But what you want to do is, you want to try and basically say, okay, the wealth that I've generated, I want to pass on to my kids, and maybe that's the same for my partner. But then if we're legally married, and what does that then look like, and a whole range of different things. So just thinking of a really simplistic example like that, if you don't think through those things, it can get quite messy. And then coming to administer those, and then I guess adhering to somebody's wishes can also be quite challenging as well. It gets expensive. It becomes a point in time of great contention and great tension. It's a challenge. So yeah, let's unpack some of the things that we see are the most common, but it can go pretty far and wide depending on your circumstances.
Yeah, and look, a lot of these outcomes, at least in my experience, I tend to find it's as a result of not thinking about the outcomes and not understanding fully the implications of what it is that you're currently doing. And I'll use an example of, it's actually a client that I'm dealing with now, so obviously not going to incorporate any names or anything like that. But the
Donald and Melania,
the set of circumstance is that my client is the child, adult, has their own life. In fact, is not necessarily young or anything like that. But her father in his later years got married to someone who was significantly younger than he was.
Mm-hmm.
Now, his intention was that, hey, the family home that I purchase with, my partner, that's going to go to my partner. And then when my partner passes away, that's going to go on to our kids jointly. Now, somewhere along the line, the father sold a large portion, almost all of his assets, and they purchased a significantly larger family home jointly and together. The consideration wasn't put as to what the estate planning implications of this are. and the younger spouse was the one that was still working because she was significantly younger, and her income was being utilized for all of the, household expenses and living expenses and all of that stuff. Father passes away, family home automatically, because it's owned as joint tenants, gets passed on to his younger spouse. Younger spouse says, yep, that's always the intention. And the adult children are left saying, hold on, my father sold all of his assets to put into the family home. The intention was for us to get, a portion of that. And the new spouse is on her will, her children that she had from a previous relationship.
Of course.
Them will inherit all of that. And so it's an absolute mess. So the point that I'm trying to make in all of this, and this is just one of probably a million different scenarios as to how we can work out how complex it is and the implications at the end of it. I mean, we're talking about millions of dollars here. We're not talking about tens of thousands. And then, the not just financial implications, but the emotional implications of, okay, what do I do now? I'm mourning the death of my father.
Yep.
Do I now take proceedings through court because I can't guarantee that, his spouse is going to, do the right thing and put us on the will and all of that stuff. And I don't necessarily want to even bring up that conversation because she's mourning the death of her spouse, and it's this complete mess.
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking through that.
Just dropping that bombshell there.
I don't even think there's legal grounds for that anyway, right? They were tenants in common. But anyway, we're not here to dispute that. But I think the point to take out of all of that is setting really clear communication, setting expectations, and having an open conversation with absolutely everybody, and then getting the legal advice to make sure that that framework and those wishes are represented. So in this instance, it sounded like there was a miscommunication or an expectation for the children that said, okay, when dad passes, we expect an inheritance. What the dad, if I'm understanding it correctly, is like, no, there's a life interest for my spouse, which is a challenge because she needs to live somewhere. She's younger as well too, so maybe her life expectancy is decades and decades longer than the father. Then when she passes away, his share in the property will go to his kids.
Yep.
But once again, it doesn't sound like that was communicated, nor was it legally set up like that as well too. So they were expecting, because he had tipped so much money in, maybe some of that money would come out at that point in time. So I think that's a perfect example of what that looks like. And above and beyond that, maybe she changed her will at some stage where the intention was to then split it between, his kids 50-50. Sorry. So his side of the family would get 50%. Her side of the family would get 50%. It sounds like maybe somewhere along the line she changed that. And yeah, you need to make sure that you've got that really well documented and bulletproof. Maybe they should have gone as tenants in common instead, 50-50, created a life interest in the property and then taking care of it like that.
But
there's ways to, there's definitely ways to do it, but that's not uncommon.
No. And that's a pretty simple scenario.
And from the father's perspective, you've also got a challenge as well too, because he's got an obligation, I think, firstly to his spouse. She needs to live somewhere.
Yeah.
And then the children come second after that. So yeah, you can kind of see it on both sides of the fence. But perfect example of needing to manage joint goals while still being respectful and thinking of the legacy issues in the family and the children. There is a way through it. It's just a matter of going through that process, getting advice, being clear with your communication, your expectation around what you want, and get someone to put it together for you. But I think the biggest thing in my experience that I've had with this is the communication piece. So whatever the parents decide to do, communicate it out to the children, to the beneficiaries, so everybody is on the same page. And if you've got any grievances or any questions, at least you can address them to that person while they're still alive and they can talk you through their thinking, as opposed to, oh, why did dad do this? Or, oh, why did mum do that? You're going to be left scratching your head and it's a futile exercise.
Yeah, exactly right. So I think that really the first step, as you've sort of alluded to, is number one, make sure that you're sitting down as a couple and deciding on, what are your financial goals? So what is it that you want to achieve? Not just right now, not just, while you're alive and while you're together, but in the instance that one of you was to pass away.
Yep.
Is it, hey, you know what? We've got this big house. If one of us passes away, we probably don't need that big of a house. We'll sell the property.
Yeah.
A portion of it will go to my children. You'll get, the other portion, and you can buy something else that's smaller and, suit your lifestyle more. Is it, hey, we've lived in this home for a long period of time and we want to make sure that you're ultimately, taken care of.
Yep.
And there's a life interest in the property. And so, when you pass away, then it will be split amongst our beneficiaries. And that's just considering, the property side of things. Is it, hey, I accumulated super before we even got together, we retired and maybe we, entered into a relationship after retirement. And so superannuation is going to get passed on to my kids, and this asset's going to just decide on what your goals are from an estate planning perspective together.
Yep.
Discuss it through. And only once you've come to that conclusion can you start to enact those goals and put things in place to make sure with your lawyer, with your accountant, with your financial advisor, that those wishes are ultimately going to be fulfilled.
Yeah, and I think the starting point is having a conversation with the professionals, but coming at it from an estate planning perspective. So thinking about your wills, your power of attorney, your guardianships, testamentary trusts if you've got some young children, and then expanding that conversation out so that the will is designed to do a couple of things, but in particular, it's designed to manage your non-estate assets, your estate assets, whereas there's also assets that sit outside of the will. So we'll talk a little bit about superannuation because that's one that people tend to get caught out on specifically, and also the family home, depending on the ownership structure as well too, which we've covered off on. But I definitely say that the estate planning conversation is the spearhead of that. So think about what it looks like eventually when you're no longer here and work backwards from that perspective. And once again, map it out and say, what would you want to see happen with your children, the money, my spouse, my assets, and so on and so forth, and be really specific around what that looks like.
And not even just your assets. I mean, your assets is one aspect of it, but then it's also your kids, right? Like if someone's been a step parent to your children, and you want them to be a guardian for your children, eventually if you pass away, talking to ex-spouses, deciding on, what would happen, can you take them full time? Do they still, like, what do you want that ultimately to look like? And it's a pretty confronting, thought process to go down. But I think that it's absolutely necessary because leaving behind an absolute mess while someone is also grieving, it's, and I think that that's, the lens that you need to look at it through, because all too often, and this comes into the conversation sometimes when you're talking about insurance, and it's, if I pass away, then my spouse and the kids, like they'll just sell the family home. We've got so much equity in that and move. And it's, okay, that might be the strategy. And maybe there isn't a need for life insurance if that's the case. But at what point in time? So do you expect them to sell the family home while they're also grieving, doing funeral arrangements? Maybe there's some time off work. Maybe there's all of this stuff that's happening and they're also needing to sell the family home.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so maybe you need a life insurance that's just going to cover you for, give you 6 months worth of breathing space to then move into something else.
Yep.
This is exactly the same lens that you would need to look at it is, in this instance, if something was to happen, it's not to say that, in all instances it's going to end up in court and it's going to end up messy, but do you want people to have to go through the estate planning piece at the start when they can make a rational decision, you can talk it through when people can understand what you're doing? Or would you rather that decision be made at the end when it's emotionally charged and people are grieving?
You're right. And when you consider the cost of life insurance, as an example, even if it was a small amount, 100, 200,000, it's very, very cheap, relatively speaking. That gives you the time and space to be able to sort of take your time, breathe through it, do it rationally at your own pace. Really good one, Andrew. I think another one where people get caught out is superannuation. So superannuation in particular can be an estate asset. So you can deal with your superannuation proceeds through your will, or you can give instructions to the superannuation trustee that falls, those instructions and that power falls outside of your will. So depending on what that looks like, if you've got it set that your will is going to take care of it and you get remarried, that automatically gets revoked. Okay. So if you had something with your ex and then you get remarried again, that no longer holds.
Yeah.
But if the trustee had a binding nomination for your ex and you don't update it, they will work their way through and they'll pay the ex out. It doesn't matter if you've gotten remarried or anything like that again. So you need to be really careful and really mindful that not only are your instructions clear, but it's also representative across your assets, specifically in this case, superannuation, because you can get caught out. And it's one of those things that people tend to miss. You need to be really specific, and not even for spouses. It could be, young children. And we've seen this. I've only seen it once in my career, but a father, he had passed away. He was married and he had a son, and he had made his son the beneficiary of his estate. The son just turned 18 when the father died. The son received all of the money from the dad's super plus the insurance proceeds, and there wasn't actually enough money for the mother to be able to then support herself and the lifestyle and the household and things like that. So he probably thought he was doing the right thing and thought, when we're old and grey and we pass away when we're old, my son will get it. So in theory, that made sense. But thinking through, he died prematurely, and all of a sudden this 18-year-old's got access to hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is a big no-no. But then his wife, who needed the money desperately, didn't have access to it.
Yeah. And even considering, especially when you're talking about superannuation, but even generally, when you're considering the structures, of how you're holding assets, there's also the tax implications as well. So what are the tax implications of, having your children as beneficiaries? You have a superannuation fund. Because they're a non-tax dependent, there's an element of tax that can get paid on superannuation proceeds if they're adult children. Or, what are the implications of, hey, rather than having children as beneficiaries on super, maybe it's, spouse is the beneficiary on super, so there's no tax that gets paid on it, and then the other assets go to children. But considering the tax implications, one, today, because you want to minimize, and, a lot of people put structures in place to minimize their tax today, but also in the future, which is once that eventually gets passed on, what are going to be the tax implications of those assets going to these people? Making sure that you're looking at everything from the bird's eye view and holistically, I think is really important, because as you start to, consider, do you hold assets jointly? Do you hold assets separately? Do you put assets in one particular spouse's name for tax purposes? What are the implications from an estate planning perspective? Do you put assets in trusts, and what impact does that have? So all of this stuff needs to be taken into account. You can't just focus on, okay, well, what's going to minimize my tax today? Because what's going to minimize your tax today is going to limit your options in the future. And then at the same time, you can't, say, okay, well, what's going to fulfill my obligations from an estate planning perspective and not consider your tax position today, because then you could be paying excess tax. So look at the broad picture, get the right professionals in the room to make sure that, one, your wishes are ultimately met, and two, you're not having any unintended tax consequences today.
Yeah. Yep. No, really good point. And probably the last thing that I wanted to close on, Andrew, is that if you think about children from multiple relationships, so we're talking about from an estate perspective, so when someone passes away. So let's just run the scenario that someone had adult children and then they got into a new relationship and had a new child, like with a new partner. By the time that person then passes away and their children receive the proceeds, the adult children are going to be adults and probably don't benefit from the inheritance, whereas the younger child from the new relationship would, just because of the timing. And obviously when you're younger, you're stacked with more debt and so on and so forth. So one of the considerations could be not actually waiting until, your estate does it, maybe doing that when they're alive. So then you can benefit the children. You can give them and gift them their inheritance essentially when it has the largest impact and they need it the most. So that could be a completely different way of approaching it as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Bills, I think that summarizes it really well. I think that really showcases sort of how complex this area can be and how important advice is from multiple professionals. So if you do have any questions, if you do want to reach out, details for Billy and myself are in the show notes. And thanks again for jumping on another podcast, Bills. Thanks to our viewers and our listeners for tuning in. And if you made it all the way to the end, it means that you've gotten some value out of it. So like, subscribe, that would help us greatly.
Like, subscribe, share, talk to your family and friends about it. Tell them that they need to get their estate planning done and their financial advice done. So we look forward to catching you on the next one.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
The information in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into account your personal objectives, financial situation, or needs. It is not financial, legal, or tax advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should consider whether the information is appropriate to your circumstances and seek professional advice before acting on any of the information provided. Past performance is not a reliable indicator of future performance. This information is provided by Billy Amaritis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Proprietary Limited, authorised representatives and credit representatives of Acumen Financial Planning Proprietary Limited.